A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. What is the most terrifying event that you have experienced in your lifetime? I was playing at the bottom of the swimming pool, pretending to be a shrimp, and I was starting to run out of oxygen, so I kicked off the bottom and my head lightly hit something. It turns out, a bunch of kids took a big toy boat, and they were riding it. I could not push it away. Just as I was swallowing a ton of water, I felt an arm come around my shoulders. The lifeguard could see the water moving wildly under the boat and came to check. I thought I was going to die that day. Swimming pools still terrify me. While walking in a parade, the two people to my right were hit by a car driven by an old man. I can still remember the blank stare on the man's face, eerie. Pretty sure everyone involved ended up okay. My friend was pinned under the car, and ended up with a shattered toe on the backboard in the picture. We were all very lucky that day. This is the first time I've read any of the news reports since it happened. Still sends shivers down my spine. When I realized that I was going to die from a heart valve infection. I had severe toxic shock syndrome, so was mostly confused and disoriented. I was in the trauma room, surrounded by nurses and doctors, and I looked over to see the head doctor talking to my dad, and him glancing at me and crying. He is super strong, I have only seen him cry a handful of times. It clicked then that the doctors figured I had a slim chance of making it. I had no energy to fight, so I kind of just had to accept that what would happen, would happen. I don't remember much after that. I apparently flatlined 3 or 4 times before they got me stable, and I knew I would live when I had severe pain everywhere. They put in a Foley catheter, and I screamed so much. That was the first sensation I had after 2 days of nothing. It wasn't fun. I woke up almost 5 days later in intensive care. I told this story before in a similar thread, but I would have to say this fire. Got woken up in the middle of the night, by what I could only register as a big vibration. My half-asleep brain has only time to think, earthquake. When boom, huge explosion. The whole building shakes. My wife and I look out the window, and all we can see is this surreal orange glow and fire trucks parked all over the street. Then a voice on megaphone starts advising people to get out your apartments, get out now. We get dressed ultra fast, I grab my backup drives and we get the F out. It looked like the whole street was on fire, which it kind of was, because the fire had spread to the adjacent building, trees, telephone poles, and even across the street. Turns out, someone had decided to burn down the ongoing condo project on the corner, but didn't know about the flammable stuff stored in the basement. This someone ended up burning down 2 affordable housing complexes, along with the condo. Congratulations. Came home from my dad's birthday dinner, to have the neighbor lady run over and ask us to call 911, because her husband hung himself on the back porch. Since I am the best English speaker in my household, it was up to me to call 911, approach this dying man, and give his wife instructions until paramedics showed up. For the record, he lived. I had a hell of a week dealing with the emotional aftershock. I can still remember his distinctive breathing and gasping for air, and the image of his body laying on their back porch with bodily fluids all over, and the noose still around his neck. I used to live in an apartment, in a bad part of New Haven, Connecticut. One night, I woke to the sound of an odd punching sound. There was the cold meat smacking sound of a punch, but a strange plunking sound as well. My bedroom window was about 10 feet from the sidewalk, so it was easy to see where the sound was coming from, 2 people directly in front of me. It was a man repeatedly swinging his arm up, around, and down into a woman's back. It was dark and it took me a minute to realize he had a knife, and was stabbing her. There were rivulets of blood streaming out of her in an arch each time he raised his arm and withdrew the knife from her body. I was stunned still for a moment, and it was just enough time to see him cut her throat and push her down to the curb. I panicked, dropped below the window sill, and muffled a scream with my hands. I heard the door to my apartment building open, and then the sound of slow footsteps moving through the hall. A short time later, I heard the door on the opposite end of the building open and close. I assumed the murderer walked right through my building. I still look back on it as if it were a nightmare. And I can still hear the sound of his fist hitting her back, as he plunged the knife all the way into her. But it happened. The police came. I filed a report, but they had already taken him into custody. I have very severe and erratic asthma. I have been in the emergency room more times than I can count, was on oxygen regularly as a child. As an adult, I had a very bad streak from 2010 to 2012, where I was hospitalized for 4+ days, every 3 weeks or so. Probably over 20 times in a 2-year span. The worst attack I ever had, I had been struggling to breathe for a few hours. Sometimes you just have to wait it out to see if it passes. My lungs closed up so tight, I slowly lost consciousness with every breath I tried to take. Finally I blacked out. I woke up briefly, in my ex-boyfriend's car on the way to the ER, and when your brain doesn't get enough oxygen, you become very disoriented. I was hallucinating pretty bad, and I was not even sure what was going on. When I woke up, they told me I was admitted at 71% oxygen levels, and I almost had heart failure. I almost died on the way there. I had a few close calls, but that one was the worst. In 2008 I developed pneumonia, and my lungs were full of fluid. That was a bad week. When I was 12, I was supposed to be watching my little brother. But, I was watching cartoons instead. He was 3. He went outside and ran up to the side of the riding lawn mower my dad was using. He got his foot caught and lost 3 toes. I feel guilty about it still. I was 5 years old visiting my grandfather's cabin in Arizona. He had done some construction work, and the telephone line had accidentally been grounded to the outside faucet. He was putting up a brick cover, since he knew kids would be visiting, but my family got there early and I went immediately to wash my hands. My mom said it was the most blood-curdling scream she ever heard. I sat there frozen, and unable to move as the current surged through me. My grandfather came over and full-on tackled me. He said he felt the current go through him too, but hoped by knocking me, he could disrupt the current, and luckily it did. I was a little kid but remember that day, as clear as yesterday. British soldier. On the last patrol of our tour, we were on a joint vehicle patrol with ANA Cross Country, about 900 m off Highway 1. I was top cover on the first vehicle, a Husky, followed by 4 ANA pickup trucks, and our second vehicle bringing up the rear. The patrol had been uneventful, and we were just heading back to the highway for a quick drive back to the FOB, when I heard the most almighty explosion behind me. I shouted "Contact IED," and immediately looked towards the contact area. All I could see was 3 ANA trucks, a cloud of dust and a mangled vehicle, upside down with what looked like a British soldier crawling out and collapsing. For a brief moment, I was absolutely convinced that 4 of my closest friends were dead. And that is what terrified me. Not being in the situation. Not bullets. Not concerns for my own safety. Just that my friends were hurt and there was nothing I could immediately do to help. To cut a long story of that day short, it wasn't my friend's vehicle that was hit, it was the 4th Afghan truck. It was unarmored, and had 8 guys on board, 3 of them sat unprotected on the rear. 7 of them survived with varying degrees of injury. The driver did not. TLDR, thought my friends were blown to pieces. Weren't. Afghan colleagues were. When I was working at a deli we had a strict, no phone policy. Usually I ignored it, and kept my phone in my pocket so I could respond to a text message when we slowed down, since we washed our hands before every customer anyway. One day, I decided to follow the rules for once just so I didn't have to put up with my manager's BS. This fateful day, about 5 minutes before I went on lunch, I got a call from my parents. Obviously I didn't get it until I went on lunch, but they left me a rather hurried and scared message about how they had been in a serious accident and were in dire need of assistance, and I never got the message. I tried calling them all throughout lunch to try and get a hold of them, to no avail, and when I told my manager what was going on, and if I could leave to go to the intersection where the accident occurred, he told me no, and if I left that I'd be fired on the spot. Sadly, I let him win by staying at work for the rest of my shift, because I really needed the job to pay for college, not knowing if my parents were all right or not. At the end of my shift when I went home, it turns out they, and the dogs who they didn't tell me were in the back seat, were all right, but the one car they had was totaled. After this event, I never let my phone leave my side, even kept it on me while I worked that shit job as well. A couple years ago, me, my sister, and friend were on our way home from the train station about 11 at night. We caught a taxi back, and gave the guy directions. Told him to go left at the end of the road, he turns right. We finally get the idiot guy to stop, and we're half a street from my home, so we figure we would just walk back. Get to the bit before the corner of the street, barely 2 minutes from my home, and this car pulls up. White crapped out Ford full of about 5 guys mid-30s. Guy in the passenger's seat gets out and starts trying to talk to my sister. I'm too tired to focus on what he's saying and finally zone in. She's been thinking he's asking for directions and trying to give him them. When I zone in, I realize he's asking us to come with him. I yell to my sister, we should run, and we take off running just as some of the other guys start to get out the car. They climb back in, almost run us down as we're running across this road. Their car stalls as they're trying to turn it around to follow us. We charge through my front garden, get inside, and lock the doors and windows. Then we had pizza. Ages afterwards I kept thinking though, what would have happened if the guys had got out the car and grabbed us? Thought went through my head for days afterwards. Either when my friend texted me that someone walked into her house while family was out at work or school. I texted her to call the police instead of talking to me. Then she didn't get back to me for like 5 minutes. I'm freaking out and I call my other friend about it, and as I was about to call the police, she got back to me and said it was her sister returning home because she forgot something for class. It was at that moment that I realized how much I took things for granted. The future is very uncertain and prone to change. I decided to confess my feelings to her. I was shot down and things felt awkward for a bit, but we're even better friends now. A less exciting story, I almost drowned during a party. No one believed me when I said I couldn't swim. I became deathly afraid of drowning as a result. I was accidentally set on fire as a kid. We were camping and I move in my sleep a lot. We had the heater on and I told my brother that I move a lot in my sleep and I shouldn't sleep next to the heater. We had a bed type thing in our tent. He told me to stop being a bitch about it. So in the middle of the night, I was really hot, so I got up. I was in a sleeping bag and I was going to get out of it, and what do you know, I was on fire. The sleeping bag was on fire, so of course I freaked, but it went through and I was on fire. I grabbed the canteen and poured all the water on my legs and hips. Thankfully it was full and it was enough to put it out. I was 14 in the hospital right after surgery to remove my thyroid, recovering. Things were going really well, except I couldn't talk at all. Later I found out my vocal cords was damaged, but that isn't the horrifying part. A few days post-surgery my face began feeling numb. Then it ran down to my fingers. Suddenly I couldn't use them at all, they curled up over each other and I couldn't feel anything but pins and needles. I couldn't write on the little whiteboard what was happening either. For those of you who don't know, there is a calcium gland near/attached, can't remember which, to the thyroid and apparently the surgeon nicked it. Also, calcium is important, not just strong bones, but muscles too. I was so low on calcium in my body that I was losing control of my hands. I saw there, tears streaming down my face, unable to make any sound, while the doctors scrambled to give me liquid calcium and vitamin D concentrate. Chalkiest, nastiest thing I've ever put in my mouth. I had to do it several times after that while I was recovering, too. And to this day I have to be on high calcium and vitamin D supplements. My dad and I were on our way to church one morning. About 15 minutes in, we started going under this one bridge like always. We saw a car flipped onto its back and on fire. I can remember a man crawling out of the window burning alive, and a woman who was most likely already dead. I was about 9 years old. The image of the man burning still haunts me to this day.